We're going to start with specifications. And you always start off with the definition, so we're going to start off with definition. And in this case, the definition right from the mighty Comar Title 21. A clear and accurate description of the functional characteristics of the nature of an item to be procured. It may include a statement of any of the procurement agency's requirements and may provide for submission of samples, inspection, or testing of the item before procurement. 21040101. A specification is the basis for procuring an item in a cost-effective manner. 21040102. So now you know where to look in Comar to find out what specifications are. Good old Comar. This is a definition we invented, so there's not something we can say look anywhere. But the purpose of specifications is to state what is to be done in a way that maximizes competition without modifying the state's requirements. That's what you want to do. You want to say what you need, but not make what you need so finite or so restrictive that it's going to preclude you being able to get good competition. Because you're not, one of the other provisions of Comar is you are not supposed to write unreasonably restrictive specifications, i.e. specifications that seem to be oriented to one or a small group of vendors to the exclusion of other vendors. So you say what you want, but what you want needs to be valid. You can't say, I want a table that's, let's say the standard height for a table is 28 inches. And you know there's one vendor that has a table that's 27 3/4 inches high. And so you specify, because you want the table by that one vendor, 27 3/4 inches, and I won't take 1 millimeter higher or lower. And there's only one vendor that makes a table 27 inches 3/4, or whatever I just said. That would be unreasonably restrictive, because why do you need one that is not at least 1/4 inch higher? Conversely, if you have something that has to fit somewhere, and it has to go in there, and you have to have a tolerance that has to mean it's within, let's say, 1/10 of an inch, or it isn't going to fit. You can say it to that 1/10 of an inch, because otherwise it will not do what you want. So in the one example, it is unreasonably restrictive. In the other example, it isn't. It is what you need. So those are characteristics. Yes?
We had that in the kitchen one time when I was buying pots.
Buying pots?
You need a big steam kettle.
Yeah?
It could only be a certain width. They wanted a certain gallons worth. So you couldn't, one company had one that was the right gallons, but it was way too wide. So we had to get those restrictions in there with the size of the pot so that they could get only, not necessarily that brand, but that size.
And was there more than one company that made the quantity and the width?
Yes.
Okay. And that was because of the stove that you had, right?
It was because of this section they had to put that pot in.
So unless you were willing to replace that section, you had to have those specifications. And presumably you weren't willing to replace that section of the kitchen.
No.
So it's a reasonable specification. And it can get so reasonable that you can get to the point that only one vendor can meet those specifications, and you have a sole source. So if, in your example, if you were the volume that you said you had to have, there was a reason why it had to be that volume, and you've already said a reason why it had to be within a certain width. If there's only one company that met that width requirement and that volume requirement, and both of those could be reasonably demonstrated to be actual requirements, that would be a justification for a sole source. But obviously we try not to have things that restrictive, because sole sources don't give you good competition. And a sole source means you're at their mercy. And we don't like to be at a vendor's mercy, because that means they get to charge whatever they want. And that's not what procurement's about. All right, I'm going to start with even more boring definitions. And if Comar isn't boring enough, I'm going to give you lots of definitions. But the reality is you have to have some concept of what I'm going to talk about, because it's going to be used in the rest of this class, hopefully an exercise we get to next Friday. And just these are things that are going to be over and over and over. So 2 purchasing definition sources. The first is the National Institute of Governmental Purchasing, NIGP. The second is the Institute for Supply Management. So those are the sources for the definitions on the next slide. And the first definition is design specifications. So specifications, but now design specifications. Per the NIGP, a specification that establishes the characteristics an item must possess, including detail indicating how it is to be manufactured, may include engineering plans or drawings and blueprints. It tells the contractor in very prescriptive terms what they are to provide the buyer. And if you go to the same thing per ISM, the Institute for Supply Management, a complete description of an item, including the composition of materials to be used in making the product, as well as size, shape, capacity, dimensions, tolerances, and sometimes method of treatment or manufacture. So the basic premise is design specification is we're telling you everything we want you to follow. We're not telling you anything about what it has to do. We're telling you what you, the vendor who's responding, must give to us. The entire risk of designing something properly is on us to tell you precisely what I want. In contrast to design specifications, you have 2 other things which are relatively similar: functional specifications and performance specifications. And so we go to these sources for definitions again. Per the NIGP, functional specification is a specification setting forth the results required for the supply or service. I'm not going to tell you tolerances and engineering documents and blueprints. I'm going to tell you what I expect the thing to produce or provide when it's done, the result. The same performance specification per NIGP. A description of a product or service that provides a general functional recital of performance characteristics required to achieve an end result or outcome desired. End result or outcome desired. It does not require the bidder offer to comply with specific design requirements. So I'm not going to tell you how to do it. I'm going to tell you what it's supposed to accomplish. And the same definition per the Institute for Supply Management, a specification that details the performance criteria required for a particular material or product. So that's the opposite. Design, performance. I tell you on the one hand how to do it, on the other hand I just tell you what it's supposed to accomplish. And these are very key issues. Risk of performance, there's that word again. In procurement terminology, the risk of performance is the difference between functional or performance specifications, the result to be achieved, and design specifications, the means that supposedly will achieve the result. So we're going to say how they relate to risk. In a performance specification, in a pure performance specification, the entire risk is assumed by the contractor. If the final intended result isn't achieved, the contractor doesn't get paid. That's if it's a pure performance specification. And the example that we did yesterday was the human resources contract for the training programs for the people on welfare, where they ended up almost going out of business because they only got paid if the people got trained and nobody was coming in the door to be trained. The entire risk was on the vendor. The reason, if it is a pure performance specification, the reason for the non-performance doesn't matter unless the state caused the non-performance or the state's improper action or inaction caused the non-performance. Yesterday, even though the state was to a degree attributable, the only thing they said was, you, the vendor, have to have the capacity, did not guarantee a single person would be provided. And so there was this provision didn't kick in under the DHR item yesterday because nothing was guaranteed. So even though in that case the state indirectly was responsible, and indirectly because of the appeals that were being done by the people who were supposedly being put in the training, but that's what is performance specifications. In the example of getting employees to Chicago, just to be a little bit repetitive, Under performance-based specifications, the contractor wouldn't get paid unless all employees got there by the required time frame. The reason non-performance happened doesn't matter unless the state was at fault, i.e., if our employees didn't show up, if the vendor got the plane tickets and had the plane standing on the runway and we didn't go, they couldn't be responsible because our people didn't get to Chicago when they didn't even get to the plane to begin with. However, if they got to the plane and the plane didn't fly, if it was a performance-based specification, we wouldn't pay the vendor. Now, what we have to look at this is that's a good deal for the state if it's a pure performance specification. All the risk is on the vendor. If something doesn't happen, we don't pay. But we have to also look at the other side of the coin. From a vendor standpoint, most of the time, they don't like performance-based specifications because they don't like to risk having to actually do the work and get, and if they don't get anything. And so a lot of the issue is that even though what we would like is one thing, what they would like is something entirely different, and usually you have to have some kind of a compromise, something that at least satisfies to some degree both parties to the contract. And so we very seldom have pure performance specifications. And the question that is for you to develop in the planning stage is, for every procurement you're doing, how much or what components will be performance-based, what components will be basically design-based. And you have to have enough incentive for vendors to do the work, or you're going to put out a specification and no one's going to bid. Because unless they get some return, they're not going to play ball. Just like most of you wouldn't walk across the street for the dollar yesterday. There's got to be enough inducement for a vendor to do it, and if there's too much risk, they're not going to play the game. Let's see. With performance-based specifications, we wouldn't tell the contractor to buy tickets, charter bus, etc. We would require the contractor to provide the means to get the employees to Chicago by the required time and date, but we wouldn't tell the contractor which of these combinations or which of these or which combination of these to use. We might say what's permissible or not permissible, but we wouldn't tell them exactly do this or do that. In the example again, the contractor gets paid if it's design. So I want to just contrast. Under performance, that's what these couple slides dealt with. If it's performance, the vendor gets paid if the employees get to Chicago, and if all kind of things happen, if the plane doesn't fly, if there's a strike, if they buy train tickets and the train doesn't get there, the vendor doesn't get paid, even if they did everything to line things up. And if supposedly these other circumstances are beyond their control, if it is a pure performance specification, they don't get paid. And that's when you can extend to that, and you can think if you're a vendor, you can do efforts, and if it's things beyond your control that you can't say whether it's going to happen or not happen, you still want some money because you did some effort to get everything that you could control to be done. So that's why you usually have this combination of design and performance. So now, in contrast, we're going to go to design specifications using the same example. If we told the vendor to buy tickets, and they bought tickets, even if none of our employees got to Chicago, they get paid for what they did because we didn't tell them to achieve a result. Well, the only result we said was buy tickets, and if they did it, we paid them to buy the tickets. So if the contractor made all the specified arrangements, got the tickets, chartered the bus, etc., it gets paid. If there's a strike, train derailment, no one made it to Chicago, it gets paid. Maybe we can go and try and get a refund from Amtrak or the bus company, etc., but our contractor did what we told it to do, they get paid. So that's the simple juxtaposition of the one type of contract type or specification type versus another. And in reality, most specifications are a combination of performance and design specifications because you have to be sensitive for what vendors are going to be willing to do. Because again, if you write specifications no one will respond to, you're not accomplishing anything. So there's that magical equilibrium. How much can you get away with being performance-based? How much can you get away with being design-based? And what is the proper balance? And that's the tricky thing you have to try to figure out in your planning stage. Now, you can adjust that during the procurement itself. If vendors come in and ask questions or say, I'm not going to respond unless you change this, you have to decide in the procure stage whether to change it. But in planning, you should have debated all these issues. You should have said, okay, well, what happens if we start off saying this is pure performance? And we basically get a lot of pushback from the vendors, which it's very possible we're going to have a number of vendors that are going to say, we're not going to play the game if that's the way you keep it. So let us agree ahead of time that if only one vendor says that we won't go ahead and do anything. But when we have 3 vendors or 4 vendors or 5 vendors that are saying they're not going to bid under those specifications, then we'll go ahead and change it. You can plan that while you're debating what to do in your planning for the specifications. So in this combination, there are things that we want to make sure happen as an end result. So there are things we tell the contractor must be done. There are also things we want the contractor to do as a means to the end, sometimes. And so we tell the contractor how to do it, etc. So you need to figure out which way to write each aspect of the specifications to try to achieve the best result for the state. And sometimes the best result for the state is something that gives a reasonable deal to the vendor. Combination specifications spread the risk between the state and the contractor. In the travel example, we could have had performance specifications, but also have allowed circumstances when the contractor would be paid, even if the end result wasn't met, for circumstances beyond its control. For the labor strike, weather delays, equipment failure on the part of the carrier, not the vendor. So you only get paid if they get to Chicago unless one of these 3 circumstances happens, and then they can see, well, I'm getting paid for the things within my control, or not paid for the things within my control, but I'm not being penalized for things not in my control, so I'm going to go ahead and respond. So that's an example of some of the combination. The ratio of risk between the state and the contractor, how much risk will the state assume and how much will be transferred to the contractor, is one of the key issues to be decided by the IPPM team. And this is done by determining which elements of the specifications will be design-based and which will be performance-based. And there's no easy formula. You just have to throw it out there, kind of debate it among yourselves. What do you think? What do you think if we do this one this way, this one that way, etc.? And either someone's in charge and makes the decision, or if it's unanimous, fine, or if it's majority vote, however you do it. But you also should plan what happens if the vendors say they're not going to do it that way. So that if you did that planning up front, if they do it, you don't have to get people back together who might be on vacation or sick, etc., and delay you making decisions on how to answer questions or comments. That's the advanced planning. By bringing together involved personnel with different strengths, different backgrounds, different perspectives, there can be a full debate on each and every significant aspect of the specifications. Aspect by aspect, it can be decided which will be outcome-based or performance-based, and which will be the contract will be directed to do or will be design specifications. And we do not at this time have our wonderful peanut butter and jelly exercise, but hopefully next Friday, because this is a fun exercise, plus it has actually, I think, significance. And the fun thing that hopefully will be coming next Friday is the assignment is going to be what you see here. For you, as in your groups, to sit down for about 15 minutes or so and write how to do a peanut butter and jelly sandwich as design specifications, and then how to write it as performance specifications. So you and the group will actually write down exactly, one way, exactly how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and another way, not saying exactly how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but saying what you want a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to kind of look like or taste like when it's all done. And then, after you write this as your group in about 20 minutes, Then you switch your specifications with another group who then has bread, peanut butter, jelly, etc., and following your specifications makes a sandwich. And then the group that made your sandwich shows it to you and says, is that what you wanted it to look like? And it's surprising how often there is a disconnect between what you thought you wrote and what they produced. And then the analysis is, did they not follow the specifications, or did they follow the specifications, you just didn't write it the way you wanted it? So hopefully next Friday we'll have that. Before lunch. Yes, before lunch, right before lunch. Breakfast? Okay. All right, so moving on. Performance-based contracting in an hour. Performance-based contracting is a relatively new name, but not a new concept. COMAR 21040103 identifies a preference for functional or performance criteria over design and detailed physical descriptions. So if you would have in 1981 gone back and looked at 21040103, you would have found that even back in 1981, describing functional and design criteria versus design and detailed physical description criteria, and saying performance is better than design. So it's at least 29 years old, at least within Maryland procurement. COMAR 21040103 became effective July 1, 81, has been essentially unchanged since then. Most of Title 21 was originally based upon the American Bar Association 1979 Model Procurement Code for State and Local Governments and the companion Model Procurement Regulations. And we said that in the overview class, if you took that. So these are based upon things that were in place at least in 1979 and well before then. So what is now called performance-based contracting, otherwise known as PBC, is the latest chapter in a long history of public procurement evolution. From anything goes, meaning few formal laws, rules, regulations, etc. in the 1800s and early 1900s, to the reform movements of the 1930s that produced civil service, because civil service only came into effect, widespread effect around the 1930s. Formal procurement laws and regulations, etc., only evolved, 80 years ago? And started off with the federal government, so these things have been picking up speed since then. And the procurement laws in the 30s, etc., emphasized written specifications and contracts, sealed bidding, with awards being made to the responsible bidder with the lowest responsive bid price, and at the time when most procurements were for tangible physical items in construction. So historically, going back 80, 90 years, the prevalent procurement process was strictly low bid. And there actually was a time when if it wasn't something that you could bid by low bid, there were no laws or regulations to tell you what to do. So that's something that's a relatively recent phenomenon. So it's evolved to evaluated procurements based upon best value for service and other non-tangible item-based contracts. So it's coming more into now the service arena where we're doing evaluations. As the U.S. economy evolved from primarily manufacturing-based to primarily services, as government purchases of services and IT increased substantially, and price was no longer the only important aspect in making an award, because services usually cannot be specified with the precision of commodities. What a particular vendor was to provide was at least as important as its price to do so. So the evolution of how we do procurement. The result was what originally was called competitive negotiations. If you went back to 1981, when the Maryland procurement law went into effect, you would not have seen competitive sealed proposals. You would have seen competitive sealed bidding and competitive negotiation. And the feature of competitive negotiation was that you're going to have a technical review of a vendor's offering and their price, so the combination of technical and financial. The name competitive negotiation was changed to competitive sealed proposals within Maryland on July 1st, 1987. And most of the procurement dollars spent in procurement in Maryland are done by competitive sealed proposals. At the Health Department, you do many, many procurements by sealed proposals because you know that most of the services you procure, you just can't say, I'm going to award to the lowest bidder. And for environment, a lot of stuff you do is by sealed proposals as well. Most of what state agencies, period, spend the money on is by sealed proposals. Okay, regarding the previously mentioned NIGP procurement dictionaries, both the 1996 and 2007 versions have definitions of 3 types of specifications: design, functional, and performance. These terms have existed for many years. The 07 version has a definition for performance-based contracting. The 1996 does not. So at least in this example, in 1996, there was a definition by the NIGP. Well, in 2007, there was a definition by the NIGP of performance-based contracting. And in 1996, there was not a definition. So in that 11-year span is when the concept of performance-based contract came into being. So it's relatively recent in the scheme of things. And you will hear sometimes the notion of this is, if you want to use the words, the new fad, performance-based contracting. And so this is the new panacea of how things should be done. In fact, about 2 to 3 years ago, the legislature, by a language in the budget bill of that particular year, directed the Department of Budget and Management to explore the feasibility of writing performance-based specifications in state procurements. And our answer was, well, we've been doing that for years. We've been doing that as long as we've been doing procurements, looking at this. But the legislature and the people that were advising the legislature had now latched on to this new terminology of performance-based contracting, and they thought it was something new and revolutionary, and maybe we should get on the bandwagon to do this new thing that we said it ain't new, and we're doing it. All right, so we met the requirement. So we're going to go more on this. So even though it's relatively new, because it is in vogue, we're going to explore what performance-based contracting involves, which is not new. Performance-based contracting, per the NIP definition, a contracting method to ensure that required performance quality levels are achieved and the contractor's total payment, as well as non-monetary incentives and disincentives, are related to the degree that services performed meet contract standards. So you read that and you know exactly what it means, right? You got it. Incentives, disincentives, yep, we got them down. And things that the NIGP focuses on are outputs, outcomes, inputs, and output. The goods, services, and ideas that result from the conversion of inputs. So an output is something you get from an input. Okay, you got that? And I'm trying to exaggerate this a little bit. Outcome, a measure of the results that occur because a service is provided, used in performance contracting to measure contractor compliance. They don't define process. The input is essentially a measure of effort to try to perform a contract. So one of the things that supposedly you look at in performance-based contract is you separate what activity is an input, what activity is an output, and what activity is an outcome. And you supposedly try to get outcomes that you specify and try to achieve outcomes, and you try to not focus on inputs and outputs because inputs and outputs are not outcomes. You're allowed to laugh. You're allowed to say, huh? But I'm telling you what it is. And an example of an input is labor hours. And you can think of this logically, that if somebody spends 10 hours on an activity, and you have some means to validate they spent 10 hours. Well, okay, they spent 10 hours. That's nice. But what did they achieve for that 10 hours of work? If they spent 10 hours and did the proverbial spinning of the wheels, scratching the head, trying to figure out what to do, or just paralyzed by inactivity or whatever, they could have spent 10 hours and have nothing to show for it. So the question is, depending upon the type of specifications we have, the way that we pay for a contract, do we pay for 10 hours if a vendor can document they exerted 10 hours of effort, or do we only pay if they actually achieve something? And that may sound real simplistic. Yeah, we only want to pay if we get something, but there's certain activities that it's hard to be able to determine outcome, or vendors themselves don't want to be at risk for outcome. They would want to be paid for effort. And so these are the kind of things. Do you pay for effort, or do you pay for achievement? And theoretically, the more inputs devoted to a contract, the more outcome or output or outcome is received theoretically. But inputs may not be effective, just like what I just said. Just because a contractor, employee devoted an hour of effort on a state contract doesn't mean the hour was effectively applied. No meaningful result may have occurred. So under functional or performance specifications, including performance-based contracting, the emphasis is on tangible results, not effort, output, and especially outcomes, not input. And I will tell you the first time I ever heard an inkling of this happened about 17, 18 years ago when I was down at the Board of Public Works trying to get a contract, a housekeeping contract for the Rosewood Center approved. And Governor Glenn Denning was the governor. And so I was called to come up and testify on this contract for the Rosewood housekeeping. And I think I had ended up throwing out one vendor because of something, and the governor asked a question, and I gave him an answer, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said something to the effect that it sounds like you were judging the vendor's output by their input. And I stood there and apparently had this bewildered look on my face like, huh? Because he repeated it and then he said, oh well, never mind. And then, except he did say one thing. He said, have you ever heard of Dilbert? Which, believe me, at that time I never had. And I said no. So he obviously said, that's when he said never mind. But what I later found out, when I found out what Dilbert was, what he was basically kind of insulting me. He was saying that I was like a Dilbert cartoon standing there trying to explain something and explaining it the reverse of what seemingly made sense. But he had pity on me and it got approved anyway. So yes, outputs, inputs, Dilbert, and now I'm a Dilbert devotee. So, okay, moving on. Process. Process is the way that inputs are applied. In design specifications, the contractor uses the inputs we specify in the manner we specify. So design specifications, the contractor uses the inputs like hourly labor or something else of that nature, the way we tell them to do it. So regardless of whether any beneficial result happens, the contractor gets paid. We told it what to do, so we are responsible for the success or lack of success of the result if they did what we told them to do. That's all they're responsible to do, is follow directions. And we have the risk on whether those directions accomplish anything. The following are recommended components for procuring services under PBC, and some of these, hopefully all of these, are going to sound very simplistic. Number one, have a written contract. And you say to yourself, well, yes, we have to have a written contract. Theoretically, anything over $500 in Maryland law has to be a written contract. But they are advocating for performance-based contracting, have a written contract, because in the analysis that accompanied the things I have read, many governments supposedly don't require performance-based or services to be in writing, to have written contracts. So, all right, we're way ahead of the game in terms of having written contracts. Number two, another characteristic of performance-based contracting is there are to be formal procurement laws, rules, and regulations. And we have had that since July 1, 1981. We had it even before that, but not nearly as comprehensively. So for 29 years now, we have measured up on that aspect of performance-based contracting. Allow best value awards, not just low bid. Reportedly, many governments only allow procurement still by low bid. And obviously, low bid doesn't cover all procurement circumstances. So a key component of performance-based contracting is it has to be a best value, i.e. evaluated type of procurement that combines both technical offering and financial. And as said, all this has been in place in Maryland since '81. So far, so good. We're on board for performance-based contracting. Components. Now here's where we start getting some other specifics. Supposedly, if you're doing performance-based contracting, you will start with a need statement. And we talked about yesterday focusing on the problem to be solved or the need to be achieved. What are you supposed to do? That's what a need statement is supposed to do. If you have to, before you start a procurement, figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish, it certainly should help you focus on accomplishing that objective. Focus on what you're trying to do and then tailor your specifications to accomplish what you say you're trying to accomplish. Focuses on whether excuse me, an activity should be done by contracting rather than by state employees. For most procurement activities, this decision will already have been made. This aspect was reviewed in the overview class and also in planning under needs identification, what I just said. Very rarely will an activity return to being done by state employees once it has been done by a contractor, what you would call returning it in-house after it has been outsourced. And I mentioned briefly the one example yesterday for highway administration, because of a protest, started having the rest stop cleaned by their own employees versus a contractor. That's about the only example I can think of where there was in-house, but that was only temporary. Continuing with the components. The second key component of performance-based contracting is create the means to assess performance. So it's one thing to say what you need, and then the very second thing they do is how do we determine whether we get what we want to be achieved. So that is what we're saying again, contract management. Writing in your specifications what is going to be the evidence of contract management, the evidence that vendors are complying, something that goes with the contract compliance checklist from this morning. So they call it a quality assurance plan. There have to be identified standards of performance in order to tell if a contractor has performed. Performance standards. How do we know if they're doing what we require them to do? And the trigger that happens if they're doing what we require them to do is pay them what the agreed amount is. You have to have performance as specified before the vendor gets paid. So you want acceptance criteria. Often service level agreements. Some of you probably, this is the first time you're ever hearing the term service level agreement. Anyone who is familiar with an SLA? 1, 2 people familiar with SLAs. Service level agreements. So what they're saying as part of this acceptance criteria, develop these agreements where it states the objective standards that must be met for proper performance. And what that means is you go down activity by activity and say what standard constitutes acceptance. And something I can think of offhand, and I might look to Joy for some of this thing, but for instance, if you're doing a procurement for health benefits, we have service level agreements. And we say things like they have to do a satisfaction survey, and 98%, 95%, what is?
Performance guarantees for call handling.
For calls that come into them, they have to be handled within a minute or X seconds of the call being initiated. that there can be no more than X number, like 2% of drop calls. There can be no longer than 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds wait time. That when there's follow-up surveys, that at least 95, 98% of the people responding have to indicate they are satisfied, very satisfied, etc. So you go down all these standards and you say what constitutes acceptance, and then for meeting these standards, the vendor gets paid, and if they don't meet these standards, then they either don't get paid at all, or they get paid something less than what they get paid for meeting full standards. So service level agreements, you kind of have to see them to really understand what they are, but at least something to throw out to you. Again, they define the objective standards that must be met for performance, and if you don't know what proper performance is, you won't know when the contractor is entitled to payment, is entitled to incentives, or should have disincentives applied. So everything comes down to price. You'd have to know what the standard is performance to know, do you pay them, when do you pay them, what do you pay them, what do you not pay them. I'm going to go to another concept, a request for information, RFI. Anyone ever heard of an RFI? Okay. What's an RFI? You didn't know you were going to be on you're either going to be the grillee, did you?
A request for information is when you basically send out to vendors information that you need.
You send out to vendors what?
A request of information that's needed in order to possibly do what they want.
I couldn't hear the last part.
A request for information is something that's sent out to the vendors for them to send back information that's needed for you to.
You're requesting information from vendors on something on the basis of what you send to them. Anyone else want to venture what you think an RFI is, those of you who were familiar?
We use that as an exploratory tool, just to get a feeler as to who's out there, and what knowledge they have, what skills, and whether or not they would have an interest in a specific project.
So you find out you're thinking about doing a procurement, but you don't know if anyone's out there that does this procurement, so you send out to find out if someone is interested. If there would be a procurement of this nature, would they respond? Is that essentially what you said?
Basically, it's no different if a politician decided that he or she might want to get some sense as to whether or not people would vote for them. So just put out a
Okay.
little poll.
Just like politicians deciding whether to run for office. I don't know if I've ever heard that analogy before, but fine. Okay. How many? I think we had, what, 4 people that said they've heard of RFIs, so the rest of you have not heard of RFIs? All right. How many think RFI is defined in Title 21?
I would think it is.
Yes? You think it might be? You think it might be?
Yeah.
You think it might be? You don't think so? You think so? All right, well, let me tell you, if you went to Title 21 and tried to look up a request for information, you would not find anything that told you what a request for information is. Because as far as Title 1 is concerned, Title 21 is concerned, a request for information does not exist. Now, we have this strange situation that we have, at least a lot of us, or some of us, familiarity, or we think we have familiarity with something that when you get right down to it, if you go to see what is it, what are the rules, what do you not do, you're not going to find anything. And so that leaves the question of, well, does that mean you can do it or you can't do it? And of course, the first thing we have to do for most of you is say, what is it? And so we're going to start giving you the DBM perspective on requests for information. So, and the reason why we're emphasizing this is if you use this new concept of performance-based contracting, they recommend the routine use of RFIs, requests for information. And so since it is something that is commonly recommended for PBC-type procurements, we're going to at least tell you what it is. A request for information can take 2 forms. It can generally describe a procurement an agency is considering doing and simply asking vendors if they likely would respond, exactly as mentioned up here. Nothing is asked for or expected except an indication of interest. Yes, if you, state agency, put out a solicitation to ask for this activity, I, as a vendor, likely would respond to that request for information. And the presumption would be, when you put out an RFI, even one as simple as would you respond or would you not respond, what you're supposed to specifically say is vendors should not submit prices or proposals. A request for information is a request under this basis of would you likely respond? And the reason for doing something is, as you said already, is it even worth me writing specifications, taking all the time and effort to write specifications to put something out if seemingly there's nobody that will do it? Conversely, if I do an RFI and I get 2, 3, 4, 5 vendors that say, yes, I would likely respond to something like that, then I might decide it is worth my while to write specifications to at least put something out to see if they actually would respond. So the last bullet up there is under this form of an RFI, the state likely would not proceed with the procurement if there were no responses of anyone saying that they would respond. You'd say, okay, not going to do it. Yes?
How much information do you put out there in this request for information?
I will hold off on that question to see how much is in the slide. And I really don't know if we've said much in the slide, and if we don't, then I'll tell you my take on the thing. And you might be surprised at my take on it. Gary's not surprised because he's heard this before. Second type of RFI. The state can also issue an RFI to ask vendors to submit generic literature describing their involvement in the area of the proposed procurement, suggestions of what the state should include or avoid in the procurement being considered, but the RFI would instruct vendors again not to provide detailed proposals or prices of any kind. And you should not see the handout, because there is no handout, because when I went and looked at it again, I wouldn't even want to give it to you as a handout because I don't agree with what it said. And I didn't do it. It's something that I and my assistant AG commented on at one time and gave some advice to another agency of what they should do. And in so many words, in the final analysis, they didn't follow our advice, and so we don't subscribe to what they did. So I'm not going to give it to you as an example of what to do for something we don't think is you should follow of what to do. So, and the next time this is done, that won't be there. An RFI is not mentioned under Maryland's procurement law or regulations. From a practical standpoint, perspective, an RFI doesn't exist. The closest thing in Title 21 to an RFI is a request for general expression of interest. An RGEI is in Title 21, bless you. But the only place you will find mention of RGEI is in 21-1401-04, having to do with non-competitive negotiated procurement of human, social, or educational services, which basically, for those of you who do human services procurements, is continuity of care. So DDA, mental hygiene, alcohol and drug abuse, AIDS administration. I'm trying to remember all the different administrations of DHMH. You can use continuity of care for a client that is in service when there's a determination made that it would be detrimental to the interests of the client to change providers. And so you can continue with the provider under continuity of care under this provision, or you can get new vendors through a non-competitive methodology if there's a determination made by the procurement officer that there's more than one vendor who can provide the service needed, but there is an absence of effective competition. And what that means in straight terms is there's more demand than there is supply. And we need all the people, we need all the vendors we can get. So even though there might be 20 of them, 50 of them, if there's 50, we need 70. So we're going to contract with every vendor that is willing to take our clients that we can negotiate a proper price with. and that is what non-competitive negotiated procurement of human, social, and educational services means, and that's the place that uses a request for a general expression of interest for them to simply communicate if they do an activity for a human service type of situation. Other than that, there is nothing that is on RFI just by itself. And even if you're talking about the human, social, or educational services, they can only be done by Human Resources and Juvenile Services for foster care. Those are the only ones that currently, or actually for the past 15 or so years, have been done under the RGEI process. So again, RFIs don't exist for all practical matters in state procurement. All right, but the fact that an RFI isn't mentioned in Maryland procurement law also means it isn't prohibited. No, there's nothing that says you can do it, but there's also nothing that says you can't do it. And many times our answer is, well, if there's nothing that says I can't, I can. And so let's proceed on with that basis. So we will continue to describe what an RFI is under a performance-based contract and the advisability or non-advisability of using one from the DBM perspective. Using an RFI under a PBC might be appropriate when a procurement under consideration hasn't been done before and the agency isn't sure what it should ask for, what it should specify. So if you have no knowledge, if you're trying to do something that you don't know what you should even, how you should even start, if there's someone out there that can do this, possibly you would want to start with an RFI. So before you try starting to write specifications under that scenario, you publish an RFI in eMaryland Marketplace, so you will still put it out there for public notice the same as you would an actual procurement. And also you would directly send it to vendors you believe do the subject of the procurement. Of course, if you don't know any of them, then the only thing you do is eMaryland Marketplace. But if besides that you know of a certain number of vendors that might do this, besides eMaryland Marketplace, you will send it directly to the vendors that you think might be interested. So that's the first thing. You put out the notice, you get responses, and then based upon the responses that you get, and like we said in the other couple slides, you tell them not to give you a proposal and not to give you prices. And based upon the responses, you either go ahead and then undertake writing specifications to do a procurement, or you figure that you have no responses, so it's not worth the effort, and you don't do something. So again, that's the typical reaction from an RFI if you do one. But, and here is the DBM perspective on RFIs. RFIs are generally not recommended for Maryland procurement because vendors that assist with the preparation of specifications are barred from submitting a bid or proposal for that procurement under the state ethics law, 15508 of the state government article. So if you tell them, don't give me a proposal, don't give me any specific information, but they ignore what you tell them not to do and they give you specific information, and you look at that and you say, that seems to make sense, and you then include that information in your specification, and another vendor who sees this when you actually issue the solicitation can infer that you got that information from one of their competitors, and they contest that. It may end up that the vendor that gave you that information can be barred from receiving an award. So that's a possibility. I'm not saying it's a strong possibility, but it's a possibility. But more importantly, RFIs are rarely, if ever, necessary. And I'm going to go down this road of telling you why we at DBM, and me in particular, don't think you, as a general rule, need to do this virtually ever. And in now 31 years of doing Maryland procurements, the author of this class, otherwise known as me, I've only been involved with 3 RFIs, one of which I have just disavowed, and so there's only 2 that I've actually issued myself in 31 years. And actually, for those 2 that we did it, based upon the results, we said, I don't know why we even did it. So we just proceeded with the procurement anyway. All right, so let's see. One time was the PBIS. So I remember doing it for the PBIS, And actually, I also remember before I issued the RFI in that occasion, I specifically went to the General Counsel for the State Ethics Commission, showed her a draft of the RFI that we were proposing to send out, and asked her whether, in her opinion, vendors who responded to that RFI would or would not be barred from participating in any subsequent procurement. And she gave me some guidance as to how to change the specifications without any official direction, because she said, I'm not giving you this information officially. And actually, this same individual, Nancy Speck, ended up as the counsel here for procurement later on. But she gave us some advice, and we issued it within the confines she said, and we got information that was so generic, as the bottom line was, it really wasn't helpful at all, because the restrictions of what to ask for and what to get leaves you with almost no good purpose for having done it. So the one was PBIS, and one for the RFI handout, which I don't want to even give you, and I can't even remember the third one. I just remember I did one. So that should give you an indication of the love I have for RFIs. RFIs should, these are some general rules again, should never involve vendors submitting proposals, making presentations, or product demonstrations. So that's one thing we want to say categorically. Should not involve proposals, presentations, or demonstrations. And most people think, well, that's what we want. We want them to come in and do a demonstration. And actually, what tends to happen with RFIs is they tend to be a procurement in everything but name. And if you do what you call an RFI, but if it looks like, smells like, acts like a procurement, it's going to be treated like a procurement. And if you try to do something on the basis of an RFI, you may specifically run in opposition to the procurement regulations. And I can tell you a particular situation from a number of years ago where something we learned of an agency that did an RFI, and on the basis of an RFI, I think they had 5 responses, and they brought in all 5 vendors for 2-hour demonstrations. And these demonstrations were attended by I don't think they called it an evaluation committee, but it was everything but an evaluation committee in name. And they had follow-up with the vendors in terms of these demonstrations. And on the basis of these demonstrations, they ended up actually issuing a solicitation that specified the product or activity of one of the vendors who gave them the demonstration. And when it came to DBM and we found out all these circumstances, we categorically rejected it and said, you can't do that. And so everything the agency had done in that respect, we said, number one, it was a waste of time, and number two, now you've kind of contaminated the procurement process by what you've done prior to this. So they got in a very sticky situation. So an agency should never have an evaluation committee review vendor responses, because the vendors aren't supposed to give you responses, and you're supposed to tell them not to give you responses. If done improperly, an RFI might resemble procurement in everything but name, without the rules and procedures required for procurement, which means that any result is subject to being challenged and invalidated. What I just said. A properly constructed RFI should be issued to 2 or more vendors, and vendors should properly respond in writing to avoid ethics issues. Vendors providing generic information or suggestions are not construed to be assisting with specifications. If you can go out and get this information from sources, if you can get it from trade shows, whatever, they can send it to you. But it's not going to tell you much.
The key is that it's generic.
It is generic. It is not specific. Yes, it is not a proposal.
Because typically, in my capacity as a maintenance chief, I'll talk with 3 or 4 vendors about specifications, but I'll be talking generically. And I won't be talking about their proprietary, I'll be talking about general information.
General information. Another thing that's a key consideration is when you're talking to vendors, are you doing it when number one, when a contract is, a specification is already issued, or even when one is not issued, but you're thinking about doing one? And you have to be very much more circumspect, certainly when you've issued one, you probably shouldn't be talking at all. And if you're thinking about issuing one, you still should be very careful on who you meet with and what you discuss. But the more generic it is, the better.
That's key.
And obviously, if it's generic, what good is it? Because it isn't going to let you do much of use if it's generic. But you can get generic information. There's also a danger that an agency will inadvertently ask for too much information, or a vendor will provide what amounts to a detailed proposal. And again, if the agency uses improper information in the solicitation, the vendor that provided the information is disqualified for participation in the procurement. Now, isn't that a good thank you for responding to your RFI? Now you can't participate. Not using an RFI avoids this risk. Continuing on, RFIs are not needed for a performance-based contract. And I'm going to tell you why I give you that supposition that you don't need an RFI for a performance-based procurement. The essence of a PBC is to focus on the overall objective to be achieved, minimizing, detailing, or specifying how to achieve the objective. An absolute PBC would have no prescriptive requirements of how the intended objective is to be achieved, and by definition, PBCs must be procured by an evaluated procurement, i.e. competitive sealed proposals. If nothing, and this is something I'm going to submit for you to just kind of think about a moment, to ponder on. If nothing has to be specified for a pure PBC, the essence of performance-based contracting is we don't tell you what to do, we tell you what has to be achieved. So if we don't tell you what you have to do, we don't have to get input from you, a vendor, as to what we should tell you to do in a specified, detailed manner. There's nothing we need from you that tells you what solution we need solved. We can just say, here's what we need solved. And if I'm not going to specify how to do it, but leave it up to you to come back and tell me how you're going to do it, I don't need to ask you how I should tell you to do something I'm not going to tell you how to do. Now, does that make sense, or does that seem like double talk, or is everyone so confused you don't even know what I'm saying at this point in time? How many vote for the latter? At least you know I had more than one option. How about that? I'm going to submit some more things from my perspective. And it's not just my perspective, it's shared by the attorneys at DBM and some other people at DBM. It takes time to prepare, issue, and seek responses to an RFI. So number one, if you issue it, it's going to take some time just to write it, particularly write it properly. It's going to take time to put it out there. You have to give vendors time to respond. So you're taking some time to do an RFI, maybe a week. Let's just say a week to send it out, and to get responses, although to send it out and get responses, you'd probably do 10 days. An agency will then need to assess the information provided. So you take a couple days to look at it, to see if the RFI provisions are consistent with state ethics requirements. The resulting solicitation disqualifies any of the vendors from participating in the procurement. So you're looking to see if you do this, you're going to bar anybody. And so on that basis, what, if anything, from the responses are you going to incorporate into your solicitation? But if you only get generic responses, and if you only say what the outcome is to be achieved, there's nothing the vendor can send you that probably is going to have any value. So I obviously am espousing an opinion on this and trying to convince you to follow my opinion. No vendor RFI response is binding. That's something key to you, for you to remember. You put out an RFI. You invite vendors to respond. A vendor can respond and can say anything they want. Yes, I'm going to respond. No, I'm going to respond, whatever. And nothing they say matters in the least when it comes to an actual procurement. A vendor might say it would respond to a solicitation for the indicated procurement and then not respond. Even if a vendor provided comments or suggestions, it still might respond. So they may tell you something that, yes, we would respond if it looked like this or acted like this, and when you did make it look or act like this, which is a risk if you do, they still might not respond. You don't know why, but they might not anyway. Also, and these are where we start talking about some particular considerations, vendors may be hesitant to make any suggestions at all. And actually, a prudent vendor probably should be hesitant to make any suggestion at all. That if they understand the ethics provision, they know that if they respond and they give you any real information, that number one, they might be barred from receiving the award. Also, aside from that, if you incorporate information in the solicitation from them, it might tip off their competitors to what they have as a strategy. They wouldn't know necessarily who is the one who suggested that, but at least it's something they could say to themselves, gee, I never thought of that. And so maybe a competitive secret has just been divulged by someone giving you information in responding to an RFI that is other than generic, which they shouldn't do to begin with. I keep having double talk here. Plus, vendors that don't respond to an RFI can still respond to the RFP. So the failure of a vendor to respond to an RFI has no significance in terms of whether they can or cannot respond to an actual solicitation. So neither responses nor the lack of responses should be an indication of what to expect in the real solicitation. If it doesn't matter whether I do or don't, why should I? And so what can you as an agency gather from either a response or a lack of response if a response or lack of response has no meaning from whoever does it or doesn't do it? Conversely, anything that can be done with an RFI can be done in a sealed proposal procurement. There is nothing you can ask for in a RFI that you can't ask for in a sealed proposal procurement. Specifications can be changed before the proposal due date. So one of the key things we advocate in the procure class is you put out your specs, you get questions, you get suggestions, you answer those questions, and when it's appropriate, you change your specifications. And you can change specifications up to the date of receipt for a sealed bid procurement. And you may have to change the receipt date depending upon what you change. And for sealed proposals, under some circumstances, you can even change the specifications after receipt of proposals. And so if something comes up that you think is appropriate to incorporate in your specifications, just because you put it out one way doesn't mean you can't change it to incorporate what you're now finding as a suggestion, that vendors under a real procurement can give you real non-generic responses, non-generic questions, non-generic suggestions, and anything they say is permitted and nothing they say will bar them from participating in the remainder of the process. And since it's a real procurement, this is when they have to act. They have to either respond or not respond. If they don't respond, they're out. So you're going to get something more genuine from an actual procurement than you're going to get from an RFI. Let's see. Proposals can be changed except for something set in law or regulation. Change can be slight, major, complete rewrite. And the only thing is they have to be sufficient time to consider the change and incorporate it in their responses. With a sealed proposal procurement, vendors that are interested in the procurement will respond with suggestions and questions. Suggestions and questions will generally not bar a vendor from continuing to participate in the procurement and receiving an award. Time for questions and answers should already be built into the procurement process, so no extra time is taken if you simply do the procurement versus if you do an RFI and then follow up with the procurement. Because the time you did for the RFI is in addition to the time you're still going to take for the procurement itself. Yes?
When vendors present their suggestions or questions, does that information also have to be relayed to other potential, just as you would do with a normal?
When vendors send in questions or suggestions in a procurement, the typical situation is you will send that question to all vendors that you are aware have received the specifications, and you will send the answer to that question to all vendors who have received the specifications. And that's something that you will say right in your solicitation. The general caveat is except for questions that are either repetitive or questions that are obviously specific only to the vendor who asked them. All questions that are not repetitive or specific only to the vendor who asked them, will be sent to all vendors receiving the solicitation, that we know received the solicitation. That way everyone's on notice, that they're encouraged to ask the questions, but they also know that we're not just going to deal with them and them alone. That everyone's going to get the benefit of the question and the answer.
I can't let this go without saying...
The dissenting opinion.
Well, not totally. Some of this is very painful for me to listen to. And the reason is that some years ago, probably 3-4 years ago, and I forgot the circumstance, but I really thought that there was a lack of information that one of our agencies had in attempting to do a procurement. They just seemed to be all over the place in trying to define what it was. And it seemed at the time that trying to look around and see what information was available would be helpful. So I spoke to Joel and he talked me out of it the same way he's talked all of us out of doing it now. However, I will say that it often is necessary for an individual to get more information than they're being presented with. So for example, we had this data entry contract that I mentioned. And the way it was to have been done was manual double entry. So the piece of paper would come up before an operator, they would enter the information, that same paper would go to another operator, they would enter the information, they would be electronically compared. If they weren't identical, it would get kicked back to a third person who would look at them and see what to do. Well, you know, we're in technology more than we've ever been. So wouldn't it be obvious that optical character recognition could be used to do that process, eliminating the operator, lowering your costs, increasing your accuracy rates, and so forth. I couldn't do an RFI to say, you know, is OCR being used for replacing double data entry? So what you have to do is to thoroughly do an internet search and get information that way. Talk to an IT guru that may be in this department or maybe somebody else, but they're not in the business of selling software that's OCR software. So although you can't do an RFI, or you shouldn't do an RFI, you do have to gather information, and there are ways of doing it. If you can find a procurement that had just recently been done by another government entity, even if it doesn't provide for piggyback opportunities, you can look at that. You can look at all the specifications. You can look at if they'll give it to you, which they should, you can look at the resulting contract that came out of that, compare it to the original specifications, and you can use all that information that's publicly available to help you write what it is that you need to do. So my angst comes from trying to, I don't want to see people avoiding the research that's going to give us a better procurement or a better purchase of a commodity, because there are certainly things out there that we can't possibly know about and that will solve our needs quicker, better, cheaper, who knows. So you just have to do the research and use Wikipedia.
Okay.
Well, he was saying that, it made me think of a lot of issues I have. Whenever I'm buying laboratory equipment, dialysis equipment, a lot of times you don't know what's even out there anymore.
Okay.
So you don't know what services are available. So I find it difficult, like Gary said, I mean, I know I need a dialysis machine, but maybe there's the latest, greatest new thing it can do that would really help the patients and the systems and all that. So sometimes it's hard to just work off of old information. I know what my old dialysis machines could do, but I don't know what's out there now. I may want a new thing, and it may be something that two different companies could offer me, but it's amazing how ignorant of the facts you are being a procurement person in a highly technical environment. You know?
Okay, let me respond to both of these issues because there's some similarity. The question of seemingly sometimes it makes sense to be able to go and ask vendors what is out there, what is new in the technological field, etc. First question is there any literature that you would expect vendors to have that would explain their product? Because again, if it's generally available, you can ask them to send it to you.
I can do that. And
Yeah,
that's not-
there's
that's
no
not-
question
okay.
that you can get generally available generic material. So it can be very specific. It can say, it can be 20 pages on here's what our model XYZ machine does. And it can, in this generic material, say, and here's what differentiates our XYZ machine from all our competitors. And as long as they give that out as general information, you can get that. And you might be able to get that off the internet. You might be able to just call someone and ask them to send it to you. Also, as Gary says, if you can do a keyword search and you can find another government has done a procurement, you can find out from those specs possibly. But the other thing I want to kind of throw out, let me throw out two different answers. Again, nothing says you cannot do an RFI. Our general recommendation is in most instances you shouldn't need to, and there's reasons why it makes good sense not to. But that doesn't say there aren't instances when you can do it and it may be appropriate. So, but giving you the cautions that if you feel you have a circumstance where despite all the general recommendations it still makes sense, then in concert with your assistant AG of exactly what to say and not say, maybe it's okay to do. Now, that's the one thing. The second thing I'll say is what's common with both of these issues is you were trying to find out what to specify. And the question is, thinking back a little further, did you have to specify anything? If you want kidney dialysis, you can, simply by going, instead of doing a sealed bid procurement, doing a sealed proposal procurement, go out to the vendors and have them to say, we need kidney dialysis and we want machines that will minimize the number of days of dialysis, I mean like number of days a week, and I'm not sure if what I'm saying makes any sense, but we want to find out how frequently machines are required for it, and I don't know whether it's every day versus every other day or something like that. Some way to minimize the intrusiveness of how you get the dialysis. I'm not very articulate in something I don't know anything about. But again, instead of specifying and telling them what the machine should look like, act like, do, etc., say we need kidney dialysis. So submit to us your equipment to perform kidney dialysis. Give us all the characteristics of your machine, what it will do, what it will not do, its energy usage, its training requirements, its installation requirements, things of this nature, and a price. And with the evaluation, you can compare the results you get because the results are all supposedly going to be machines that will do kidney dialysis without you possibly having to specify anything other than it's to be for kidney dialysis. And maybe that's the better way to go, maybe. Same thing in what you're saying. You were going to try to find out if optical scanning was a valid thing to specify. But again, if what you said is it has to do key entry, it has to do comparison, it has to validate entries and have the vendors tell you how they can accomplish it, as long as you've said what has to be accomplished, maybe that's the way to go. And I can't say either one of these is necessarily the way you should have done it, but I'm just saying it's something you can think about. And if you think about it but say, no, that's just too much work, it's too variable, and I know if I just get a little bit of information that I can say enough to take care of my situation, maybe in concert with your assistant AG, that's a situation where it does make sense. But you got to make sure you get the guidance so you get the benefit and you don't run into the pitfalls. So did that, I don't know, did that help? And maybe if I'd have told you that at that time, you'd have had a different response. I don't know. Yes?
Just to help my buddy out here, Maryland has a commission.
That buddy or this buddy?
This one. Maryland has a commission on kidney disease. It meets monthly. Eva Schwartz is the executive director. They have a whole team of nephrologists on board, and I'm sure, and they also have review nurses.
And that's nice to know, but at the time when you're doing it, what I find I try to get away from is if I go to a doctor or a specialist, he's going to give me biased information. It's happened before. He's going to say,
And if vendor's
you want
not?
to buy the Fresenius 201. That's the only machine that I use and I'm allowed to use. And you don't, it's hard because you don't even know what questions to ask. Why do I want to use that, you know? Yeah.
I understand that, but I'm pretty sure those review nurses know because they're looking for oxygen levels, patient comfort, blah, 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 and.
No, I
would
appreciate
talk-
your.
I'd even put them on my panel.
My answer to that, if you can't trust doctors and nurses, how can you trust a vendor? The vendor has more interest in saying, use mine and only mine, than someone that's just using it.
But all our end users say they want this specific machine. They never tell you what the specifications. You got to pull it out of them.
Okay? All right, let me see how many slides we have or what's a convenient stopping point. All right, let me just finish, let me finish this slide and then we will take a break because the rest of it is an example. We got 3 more minutes. Yesterday I let you out 6 minutes early. In CSP procurements, the only requirements are state the purpose of the procurement, identify the required activity, the scope of work, identify the evaluation criteria, the price to do what an offer proposes, the relative importance of technical and financial, whether multiple or alternate proposals are permitted, include the mandatory clauses. Those are the only things that are required in a competitive sealed proposal procurement. And if you look at those things and really think about it, that isn't a whole lot that you have to put in there to do a valid procurement under an evaluated procurement methodology. So I'll leave you with that to think about that, and we'll come back next week and start with a specific example of the simplicity of sealed proposals. So you're still getting out 2 minutes early.